A billionaire's daughter stops her limo and points to a homeless girl on the sidewalk. What happens next will shatter your heart and restore your faith in humanity. The fall air in Manhattan was brisk, crisp enough to bite through a wool coat, but not enough to keep the wealthy from their daily rituals. Bentleys and Rolls Royces glided past Central Park's east side, as if carried by the wind, their tinted windows reflecting the city's glittering skyline. Beneath them, however, at the edge of a rusted bench near the 72nd Street entrance, sat a girl no one seemed to notice, until one child did. Her name was Lila Grace. She looked about 10, maybe younger, wrapped in a navy blue jacket 2 sizes too big and patched at the elbows. Her wild, chocolate-brown curls were pulled back with a red ribbon that had clearly seen better days. In her lap rested a weather-worn copy of Gone with the Wind, its spine cracked and its pages lined with pencil notes in careful, tiny handwriting. She wasn't begging, she wasn't crying. She simply sat cross-legged on a folded blanket, reading out loud in a soft, firm voice that carried just enough to reach the nearby bench. In front of her was a torn piece of cardboard. It had been carefully flattened and written on in thick black marker. "We'll teach you to read, free, even if you're richer than me." Most people walked past her without a second glance, assuming she was just another street kid putting on a show. But she wasn't performing. Lila wasn't interested in pity or coins. She was interested in words. She had fallen in love with them long before her mother died, long before the shelters and the cold nights and the way people stopped saying her name. She had discovered early on that words were all she had left, and they were enough, if only someone wanted to share them with her. At precisely 4:08 p.m., a sleek black limo slowed to a stop at the curb. Inside, sitting against the cream leather seat, was a little girl in a maroon plaid uniform, white stockings, and polished patent leather shoes. Her name was Delaney Ridge, 7 years old, daughter of a billionaire real estate mogul, Simon Ridge. Delaney leaned closer to the window, her blue eyes suddenly lit with recognition. "Daddy, stop the car," she said, tugging on the sleeve of her father's cashmere coat. Simon Ridge, still thumbing through work emails on his phone, didn't immediately respond. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit and slate gray tie, with silver just beginning to touch the edges of his neatly combed hair. "Oh, what's the matter, sweetheart?" "Her!" Delaney pointed urgently at the girl with the book. "It's her, Daddy. That's Lila. She teaches me to read poems in the park." Simon's phone froze mid-scroll. He looked at his daughter, then out the tinted window. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if unsure he'd heard her correctly. "You know that girl?" "Yes," Delaney said, her voice completely sure. "She's amazing. She tells stories better than Ms. Cordelia at school. She even told me about a poem where a man falls in love with a ghost. She said words can be like magic, and she never asks for anything, not even snacks." Simon stared at his daughter, then back at the girl outside. The contrast struck him. One child in polished shoes sitting in a limo, worth more than most houses. The other cross-legged on concrete, offering knowledge in exchange for nothing at all. The driver, sensing hesitation, looked through the mirror. "Should I keep moving, sir?" Simon didn't answer right away. He was still looking at the girl, at how focused she was, lips moving as she read to no one, eyes scanning the lines like a student in a sacred ritual. People streamed past her on both sides like a river avoiding a stone. She didn't seem to notice. "No," Simon said finally. "Pull over." The limousine drifted to the curb and stopped. Delaney's face lit up with joy. Outside, Lila turned a page, unaware that her life was about to change. The air inside the Ridge estate felt nothing like the outside world. Marble floors reflected the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of long-dead industrialists lined the hallways like silent watchers of legacy. Simon Ridge stood at the tall windows of his third-floor study, gazing out at the trimmed hedges and slate pathways below. But his mind was still on that moment in the limo. On her. That girl. Lila. He hadn't said anything to her when the car stopped. He'd simply watched as Delaney had scrambled out, against protocol, against the protests of the driver, and ran straight toward the homeless girl like she was an old friend. And she was, apparently. Simon had watched, frozen in the back seat, as Delaney sat cross-legged beside the girl in her ragged coat. The two of them had laughed, genuinely, softly. Delaney was animated, pointing to a passage in the book, while Lila patiently guided her finger from word to word. It was strange, beautiful, and, if Simon was honest, deeply unsettling. because it meant someone else had been shaping his daughter's heart and mind without his knowledge. "Sir," came the voice of his assistant, Miles, breaking the silence in the study. Simon turned slightly. "Yes?" "I looked into the girl, per your request." Simon's posture stiffened. "And?" Miles, a slender man with salt and pepper temples and a reputation for never getting emotionally involved, cleared his throat. "A rare tell. Her name is Lila Grace. No known father on record. Mother deceased, overdosed 2 years ago in a shelter on 136th Street. No extended family located. She's been moving between shelters, group homes, and the streets since then. School records show she attended PS 472 until last year. Excellent marks in English, advanced reading level, but she dropped out." Simon's jaw tensed. "Dropped out? At 10? Miles nodded. "Apparently after multiple incidents of bullying, some of it physical." Simon turned away, biting the inside of his cheek. He imagined his daughter being pushed, mocked, shamed like that. He couldn't bear it. "She's been spending most days in the public library on 82nd, Miles continued. No reading, studying, asking the librarians for extra book recommendations. Mostly literature, some philosophy, even legal texts if you can believe it." Simon ran a hand through his hair. Is she pretending to be some kind of teacher?" "No, sir," Miles said, voice softening just slightly. "She's just trying to share what she knows, with whoever's willing to sit and listen." Simon lowered himself into the leather chair behind his desk and stared out the window again. But this time, he didn't see the garden. He saw that little girl sitting on a blanket with a battered book and that ridiculous sign. "We'll teach you to read free." It wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't a game. It was a mission. And Delaney, his daughter, who had every educational privilege money could buy, had been sneaking away from her nanny's watch to learn from her. A child who had nothing but still wanted to give. Simon suddenly felt the weight of all his titles, CEO, board member, investor, grow meaningless against the title father. What did it mean to protect your daughter if you weren't even aware of the things that truly touched her soul? Later that evening, after dinner and piano practice, Simon tucked Delaney into bed. She clutched a stuffed fox with a torn ear, something she'd had since she was 3. "Daddy," she said suddenly, looking up at him with innocent eyes, "are you mad that I went to the park without telling you?" Simon looked down at her and brushed a curl from her forehead. "I was scared," he admitted. "Not mad. You could have been hurt." "But Lila was there. She kept me safe." Simon's throat tightened. "Tell me more about her." Delaney lit up like a match. "She knows so many words. She showed me a poem by Langston Hughes and said it sounded like jazz. And she read me a part of To Kill a Mockingbird. And we talked about what it means to do something brave, even if it's small. And once, when I told her I got a C in writing, she told me, 'Your grade is just a teacher's opinion, but your voice belongs to you forever.'" Simon sat in silence, stunned. "She told you that?" he asked. Delaney nodded. "She said I could change the world with just my words if I wanted to." It was in that moment Simon realized something unsettling but undeniably true. No one in his daughter's elite circle, no teacher, no tutor, no administrator, had ever made her feel so seen. Not like Lila Grace did. And so, later that night, long after Delaney had drifted off to sleep, Simon returned to his study, stared at her school applications on the desk, then picked up his phone. "Miles," he said when the assistant answered, "bring the car around tomorrow morning. We're going back to the park." "Yes, sir. What for?" Simon looked at the photo still open on his screen. Lila's makeshift cardboard sign, faded but defiant. "Not to meet the girl," he said, "and properly." The morning came cloaked in a fine silver mist, casting a pale shimmer over Central Park's statues and iron fences. The city hadn't yet reached its full roar. Early joggers passed like ghosts, dogs trotted on leashes, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted faintly from a vendor just setting up. But under the same tree near the 72nd Street entrance, where fallen leaves had begun to carpet the earth in amber and crimson, Lila Grace was already there. Her blanket was folded more neatly than before, and her boots, 2 different sizes, were lined up perfectly beside her. The same cardboard sign rested in front of her, now weighed down by a small rock on each corner to keep it from blowing away. She was reading aloud again, this time from The Velveteen Rabbit, her voice low and deliberate. pausing now and then to consider the meaning behind each phrase. Her eyes would drift off for a second, and it was clear. Lila didn't just read stories, she lived inside them. Simon Ridge's car rolled up quietly, far less ceremonious than the day before. He had chosen to come without the usual entourage. No driver in uniform, no security detail dressed in black. Today, he sat in the passenger seat of a discreet black sedan, with Miles driving and watching the sidewalk through aviator sunglasses. "There she is," Miles murmured. Simon didn't reply. He was already opening the door and stepping into the cold morning air, his coat flaring behind him. He didn't approach immediately. Instead, he stood across the walkway, observing the girl in silence. She was reading to no one again, but the way she read, like someone who believed the words could resurrect the forgotten, made it feel like an audience must surely be listening just beyond the trees. She noticed him before he spoke. "You're her dad," she said quietly, not looking up from her book. Simon blinked, surprised. "Yes," he replied, stepping closer. "You know who I am?" "She talks about you a lot," Lila said, finally lifting her eyes. They were a deep hazel, too old for a child's face, as if time had pushed them forward faster than the rest of her body. "At first, I thought she was making you up. You sounded too busy to be real." Simon flinched. Not from insult, but from truth. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "I should have noticed earlier that she was sneaking away, that she was spending time here, with you." Lila shrugged, her hands still folded around the book. "She wasn't sneaking, she was searching. There's a difference." Simon stepped closer and sat down slowly on the nearby bench, careful to keep his distance, but not so far as to seem superior. The cement was cold beneath him, grounding, humbling. "You've been teaching her," he said. "Sort of," Lila replied. "She already knew how to read. I just helped her slow down. Reading fast doesn't mean you understand. You can swallow a book whole and still stay hungry." Simon exhaled slowly. "You're very bright." "That's what the librarian used to say," Lila muttered, "before the funding cuts. Now, she mostly just tells me not to fall asleep in the reading corner." "You spend most of your time at the library?" Lila nodded. "Sat when I'm not here, or looking for food. It's warm there. They don't ask too many questions. And the books, they don't judge me." Simon felt his stomach twist. It wasn't just what she said, but the calm, resigned way she said it. No bitterness, no self-pity. Just reality, spoken like poetry. "Do you remember your mother?" he asked gently, unsure why the question came out. Lila nodded again, this time slower. "Her name was Juliet. She used to dance when the radio played, even if there wasn't any music left. When I was little, she said I was born with stories in my blood. She'd make me tell her one every night before bed." "And your father?" "I don't know," she said simply. "There's a name on my birth certificate. I memorized it once. Henry Dalton. I don't even know if he's alive." "Doesn't matter." Simon's mouth was dry. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something unexpected. A sandwich, wrapped neatly in parchment. "I brought this for you," he said. "I didn't want to come empty-handed." Lila hesitated. Then, wordlessly, she accepted it. But she didn't eat. She simply placed it next to her book, as if she didn't want to interrupt the moment. Simon studied her for another quiet minute. "Lila, do you want to come with me? Just for a little while. To my home. To talk. Maybe take a shower, get warm. You don't have to stay. I won't make you." She looked up again, eyes sharp. "Why?" The question hung in the air. Simon took a deep breath. "Because you matter to my daughter. And because you matter to me. Whether you believe it or not." Lila stared at him. For the first time, the edge in her expression softened ever so slightly. She looked down at the sandwich, then at her book, then at the trees swaying above them, almost like they were holding their breath. Finally, she stood up. "Okay," she said, "but only for a little while. Books get lonely when you're gone too long." Simon smiled for the first time that day. "Fair enough." And as the two of them walked toward the waiting car, the morning mist began to lift, revealing, perhaps for the first time, the start of something neither of them could yet name. The car ride to the Ridge estate was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. Lila sat in the back seat beside Simon, her small frame nearly swallowed by the leather upholstery. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers twitching now and then as if itching to reach for a book or a pen. She didn't speak much, and Simon didn't push her. He knew enough to let silence breathe, especially when someone wasn't used to being asked to speak. As the car turned into the winding private driveway, flanked by towering sycamores and manicured hedges, Lila's posture stiffened. Her eyes darted across the wide property like she was preparing for a trap. The mansion loomed into view, 3 stories of stone and glass, regal without being gaudy. But to Lila, it might as well have been a palace built on another planet. Is this where you live? She finally asked, her voice low, uncertain. Simon nodded. Yes, for now. We travel sometimes, but this is home. Lila didn't reply. She just pressed her palms tighter together. The car stopped in front of the grand entrance, and the door was opened by a staff member in a dark gray uniform. Lila's feet hovered for a moment above the carpeted step, her body frozen between 2 worlds. But then Delaney came bursting out of the front doors like a windstorm in ballet flats. Lila! She cried, her arms flung open. Lila smiled despite herself. For the first time since entering the car, her shoulders relaxed. Delaney ran up to her and grabbed her hand. I can't believe you came. I told Daddy you'd say yes. I knew it. Simon watched the exchange quietly, struck by the depth of their connection. It wasn't just friendship. It was loyalty, mutual wonder, and something purer than most adults ever managed to preserve. Delaney pulled Lila through the enormous double doors and into the front hall, chattering excitedly about the guest room, the art supplies, and the giant closet full of board games we never play. Lila's eyes widened as she took it all in, the gleaming floors, the velvet settees, the fresh orchids, the staircase that curved like it belonged in a movie. But she didn't say a word. She only looked up at Simon once, and when she did, her expression was unreadable. Part suspicion, part awe, and part a quiet, unspoken question. Why are you doing this? Simon led her to a guest room on the second floor. It was warm and understated, cream walls, soft blankets, a window with a view of the garden. A little vase of wildflowers stood on the bedside table. There's a bathroom through there, he said gently. Towels, shampoo, everything you might need. Clothes are on the bed. They're Delaney's old ones, but they should fit. Lila walked into the room slowly, as if she was afraid to leave footprints. Thank you, she said at last, not quite looking at him. I'll let you get cleaned up, Simon said, stepping back. Take your time. He left the door cracked open and waited in the hallway for a moment longer than he needed to. He heard nothing for several seconds. Then the soft sound of the faucet running and a drawer opening and then closing. He exhaled. Downstairs, Delaney was already setting the dining table for lunch, with more enthusiasm than skill. Forks were on the wrong sides, napkins folded into shapes that looked vaguely like turtles. She's coming down, right? Delaney asked, biting her lip. She's not leaving? No, Simon replied. She's not leaving. Not unless she wants to. An hour later, Lila reappeared. She wore a simple pair of jeans and a faded navy sweater with a little embroidered fox on the shoulder. Her hair was clean and damp, tied back with a new ribbon. Her face looked different now. Less gray, more human. But there was still something behind her eyes. A readiness to run. A disbelief that this might be real. She ate quietly at lunch, answering Delaney's questions with brief smiles and polite nods. Simon watched her across the table, not with the eyes of a billionaire, but with the eyes of a man who couldn't stop wondering how a girl like this had been forgotten, passed over, left behind. After lunch, while Delaney ran to her room to find a book they'd started reading together, Lila stood at the large window overlooking the back garden. Simon walked over slowly, joining her without saying anything. She doesn't treat me like I'm different, Lila said quietly, still staring outside. You're not, Simon replied. Lila shook her head. I am, not because I want to be, but because the world made it that way. Simon didn't argue. He couldn't. She was right. I just wanted to help someone, she continued. I thought maybe if I taught someone something, maybe I could still matter, even if no one knew my name, even if I disappeared tomorrow. Simon looked at her for a long moment. You've done more than help, he said. You've reminded me what it means to matter, and I don't think you even realize it. Lila finally looked up at him. You don't owe me anything. I know, Simon said softly, but I want to. She studied him, not with the wide-eyed admiration people gave him in boardrooms or gala halls, but with the kind of quiet scrutiny that made him feel transparent, as if she could see who he really was, beneath the power and wealth and headlines. Then don't make this a favor, she said. It isn't. Lila nodded once. Then she turned to the doorway, where Delaney stood, book in hand and eyes sparkling. Come on, the little girl said. We're at the part where the witch turns into a bird. And Lila followed her down the hall, still cautious, still uncertain, but with a heartbeat louder than before. The following days unfolded like something out of a quiet, strange dream for Lila Grace. She didn't fully trust it, not yet, but she let herself drift in its warmth cautiously, like dipping toes into a lake she'd only ever watched from the shore. Mornings began with the smell of cinnamon and coffee from the downstairs kitchen, where Rosa, the housekeeper with kind eyes and a stern apron, insisted on making breakfast from scratch. Lila had never seen eggs cooked in so many ways. Delaney giggled through every meal, talking a mile a minute while Lila listened in silence, slowly growing used to the luxury of being included. Afternoons were spent in the library, Simon Ridge's private library, a sprawling second-floor room lined wall-to-wall with first editions and rare texts, many still sealed in glass. At first, Lila only stood at the edge, not daring to touch anything. But then one day, Simon noticed her lingering there. These books aren't decorations, he said. They're meant to be read. Want the key? Lila hesitated. I won't break them. I know, he said, and handed her the small brass key. It was the first time in her life someone had trusted her with anything that valuable. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked the case. The book she chose wasn't one of the rarities, but a plain cloth-bound volume of essays by Baldwin. She sat in the armchair by the window, curled her legs beneath her, and read like it was the only thing keeping her upright. But not everyone approved. Word of Lila's presence in the Ridge estate spread faster than wildfire. It began with the staff, who exchanged whispers in the hallway and darted glances as she passed. Though Rosa treated her kindly, others looked at her with suspicion. Servants who'd worked in luxury long enough to believe wealth was a wall meant to divide, not bridge. Then it reached the Ridge social circle. At a dinner that Saturday night, Simon hosted several partners, philanthropists, and legacy families. Crystal glasses clinked, and the chandeliers bathed the room in gold. Lila was not part of the event, of course, but Delaney, as usual, couldn't keep quiet about the girl she considered her closest friend. She's brilliant, Delaney said proudly, standing beside her father at the end of the meal. She helped me write my poetry assignment. She said metaphors are like magic spells. The adults chuckled politely. She sounds quite creative, one woman murmured, taking a sip of wine. Is she from your daughter's school? Asked a man in a blue pinstripe suit. No, Simon said, keeping his voice steady. She's staying with us for now. The room shifted. One of the women at the table, Carmela Whitmore, a legacy philanthropist with connections to half the Board of Education, leaned forward with an arched brow. Staying with you? She echoed. I'm sorry, Simon. I must have misheard. Are you housing a street child? Simon placed his glass down carefully. Her name is Lila Grace, and she's not a street child. She's a 10-year-old girl who has no one and has done more for my daughter in 2 weeks than years of elite education ever did. The table went silent. Carmela pursed her lips. I see. I suppose that's noble of you. Simon didn't reply, but he noticed the way her gaze hardened, not with curiosity, but warning. Later that night, after the guests had left and the clink of silverware had faded, Simon stood in his study, facing the window, jaw tight. He knew what came next. These people, his so-called peers, would not approve. They'd whisper about judgment, about influence, about how Delaney was being exposed. And sure enough, the very next morning, he received the email from the Ridge and Cummer Advisory Board. It was veiled in polite language, but the message was clear. Your personal decisions are reflecting on the company. Investors are uneasy. The child's background may pose reputational risk. Reputational risk. He stared at those words for several minutes. Downstairs, Delaney was laughing. Lila was reading to her again, this time acting out the characters with silly voices, making Delaney howl with delight. It was laughter Simon hadn't heard in his house since before his wife died. His phone buzzed. A second email. A senior board member offering a private meeting. If you remove the girl quietly, we can resolve this before any media interest. Simon clenched the phone in his hand, and then he made the mistake of stepping out into the hall, just in time to see Lila walking past, holding an empty mug on her way to the kitchen. She saw his face, the tension in his shoulders, the faint flicker of shame in his eyes. And Lila knew. She didn't ask. She didn't confront him. She simply nodded once, slow with painful understanding, and walked to the guest room. An hour later, Rosa found the room empty. The bed was neatly made. The book she'd been reading was returned to its shelf. The sweater was folded at the foot of the bed, and on the pillow was a note, written in Lila's careful, looping script. Thank you for the warmth. I never meant to bring trouble. Tell Delaney to keep writing. Her words matter more than she thinks. Simon stood in the doorway, reading that note over and over. He felt a sinking, unnameable weight in his chest. He'd let fear whisper louder than truth, and Lila had disappeared into the city once more. The house felt emptier than it ever had, quieter, heavier, like something sacred had been removed, and the space left behind couldn't be filled by silence or sunlight. Delaney didn't notice right away. She thought Lila had just gone for a walk, maybe to the library. But when lunch passed and her friend hadn't returned, she started asking questions. Daddy, where's Lila? She said she'd help me finish my story today. Simon froze. He had been sitting in his study, staring at the same document for over an hour without reading a single word. The note Lila left was still folded neatly on his desk. He hadn't shown it to Delaney yet. Not because he wanted to lie, but because he didn't know how to tell his daughter that the one person who made her light up had chosen to disappear, to protect them. She's gone for now, he said slowly, choosing each word with painful care. Delaney narrowed her eyes. Gone where? She left a note. She didn't want to cause problems. Delaney's face changed instantly. The confusion hardened into something else. Something Simon had only ever seen once before, the day her mother died. She looked far older than 7. What kind of problems? She demanded. What happened? Simon stood up. Ned Delaney! No, she snapped. You told me she could stay. You promised. Did someone make her leave? Simon ran a hand through his hair, suddenly struggling to breathe. It's complicated, sweetheart. I'm not stupid, Delaney said sharply, and now her voice was trembling. It's because she's poor, isn't it? Because she doesn't look like the rest of us. Someone said something and you let them scare you. The words hit him like a slap. I didn't want to. Then why didn't you fight for her? She cried, tears now streaming down her cheeks. She believed in me. She made me believe I could write things that matter. No one ever did that before, not even you. Simon felt his chest cave in. There was no defense. There was no excuse strong enough to stand between her and the truth. Delaney stormed out of the room, pushing past a maid who had just arrived to dust the banisters. She ran upstairs, slammed her door, and for the first time in months, Simon didn't hear music or reading or laughter echo through the halls. That night, he sat alone in the garden, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. His phone sat on the table next to him. The advisory board had called twice. He didn't answer. He didn't care. He opened Lila's note again and read it under the pale glow of the porch light. Tell Delaney to keep writing. Her words matter more than she thinks. The words played on a loop in his mind. He remembered the first time he'd seen the sign in front of her on the sidewalk. We'll teach you to read free, even if you're richer than me. She hadn't wanted pity. She hadn't even wanted a home. She had only wanted to matter, and he had taken that from her. By morning, Delaney had done something unthinkable. While Simon was still asleep, she took her iPad and recorded a video. Sitting in the big green chair in the corner of her room, eyes swollen and hair messy from sleep, she looked directly into the camera and said, My name is Delaney Ridge. I'm 7 years old. My dad is a billionaire and our house is really big. But the smartest person I ever met lived on the street. Her name is Lila Grace. She taught me how to read poems, how to write stories, and how to believe in myself. Some grown-ups said she didn't belong here. They said she would ruin everything. She sniffed, wiping her nose. But they were wrong. They are the ones who don't belong because they don't understand kindness, or books, or people who don't have money but have magic. Her voice cracked at the end. If you see her, tell her to come home, please. She posted the video to her father's public account. It was shared over 100,000 times in less than a day. News outlets picked it up by the afternoon. Billionaire's daughter defends homeless girl in viral plea. Headlines spread across every platform. Comment sections filled with outrage, heartbreak, and calls to action. Strangers began searching. Librarians, volunteers, even local teachers. Simon's office received hundreds of calls, some from donors threatening to pull support. But even more came from ordinary people offering shelter, praise, or simply thanks for raising a daughter brave enough to speak the truth. And then, 2 days later, an email arrived from the public library on 82nd Street. Subject line: I think we found her. The body of the email contained a single sentence. There's a girl who comes here every evening. She sits in the corner with a blanket and reads as if the books are the only thing keeping her alive. Simon didn't wait. He threw on his coat and rushed to the car, this time without Miles. He drove himself, heart pounding, guilt boiling inside him, like a tide that could no longer be held back. By the time he stepped into the library, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the reading room. And there she was, sitting by the window, her knees pulled to her chest, a stack of books beside her. Reading alone, just as she had been the first time he saw her. Only now. She looked smaller somehow, dimmer, until he said her name. Lila. She looked up and froze. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Simon stepped forward slowly, carefully. I made a mistake, he said. I let the wrong people decide what was right, but I know now. And I came to ask if you'll come back. Lila stared at him, eyes wide and full of something between disbelief and old hurt. You don't have to forgive me, Simon added, but Delaney, she's waiting, and I don't think she's smiled since you left. There was a long silence. Then, very quietly, Lila closed her book. She stood, and without saying a word, she walked into his arms. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it was real. And in that quiet library corner, a child who had been abandoned by the world let someone in again. Not because he was rich, but because finally he was ready to fight for her. The drive back to the Ridge estate that evening was different from the one a few days earlier. Lila didn't sit on edge like she had the first time, bracing herself for cold marble halls and judgmental stares. This time she sat quietly beside Simon, wrapped in a soft blanket Rosa had sent with him in the back seat, her head tilted against the window. The city lights reflected across her tired eyes, but she looked peaceful, or at least closer to it. Simon didn't speak much. He kept glancing at her, his grip on the steering wheel tight, as though afraid she might disappear again if he looked away too long. But Lila wasn't going anywhere. Something had shifted the moment he said her name in that library. It wasn't just the words. It was the look in his eyes, the truth behind them. When they reached the house, Delaney was waiting on the front steps in her pajamas and fuzzy pink slippers, clutching her fox plush so tightly it looked like its button eyes might pop off. She saw the car and bolted forward before it fully stopped. The door opened and Lila stepped out. Delaney didn't say anything. She just threw her arms around her, burying her face into Lila's shoulder. Neither of them cried at first, just held each other like survivors who'd found shore. "That you came back," Delaney whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," Lila murmured. "You saved me." Simon watched them, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, he allowed himself a full breath. He didn't rush them. He didn't say anything. He just watched as two children clung to each other in the moonlight like the world outside had no say in what they were building. That night, Lila didn't sleep in the guest room. Delaney insisted she sleep in her room just this once, and Simon agreed. Rosa brought extra blankets, and the two girls stayed up reading under a blanket fort, whispering and giggling until sleep pulled them under. Downstairs in his study, Simon opened his laptop and typed out a letter addressed to the Ridgencomer board. It was only 1 page long. He informed them clearly and unapologetically that if they had an issue with him opening his home to a child in need, someone who had done nothing but give selflessly to his daughter, then they could consider his resignation already typed and delivered. He hit send without hesitation. He was done being controlled by people whose morals ended at the edge of their bank statements. The next morning, something remarkable happened. When Simon came downstairs, Miles was already there waiting. "I read the letter," Miles said simply. Simon paused. "Are you here to try to talk me out of it?" But Miles shook his head. "No," he said, stepping forward. "I'm here to support it." Simon blinked. "You are?" Miles nodded. "You think people don't talk in this world? They do. And most of them, secretly, agree with you. They just don't have the courage to say it first." Simon exhaled, something loosening in his chest. "Thank you." That same day, Simon held a press conference in front of the house. Delaney stood beside him, holding Lila's hand. Cameras flashed, microphones extended. The media buzzed, eager for damage control, for scandal. But Simon didn't give them that. He gave them the truth. "This is Lila Grace," he said, gesturing toward the girl at his side. "She's 10 years old. She has lived through more than most adults can comprehend. She has no home, no family, and yet she gave mine something we didn't know we were missing." He paused, looking directly into the crowd. Compassion, wisdom, perspective. The crowd was silent, holding its collective breath. "Now, she is not a threat to my reputation. She is the reason I still believe this world can change." He didn't take questions. He didn't need to. The next morning, the internet was ablaze again. But this time, it wasn't with outrage. It was with support. Families sent messages from across the country, offers for scholarships, publishing houses offering to print anything Lila wanted to write. A public educator in Boston even called to say she wanted Lila to visit her classroom and speak to her students. Because, in her words, "she teaches better than half my staff." But for Lila, none of that compared to what Delaney gave her that same night. They were lying on their stomachs on the floor of Delaney's room, coloring storybook pages and inventing their own dialogue, when Delaney turned and said, "You know what I decided?" "What?" Lila replied, chewing on the end of a colored pencil. "I think you should be my sister. For real." Lila paused. Her throat tightened. You mean adopted?" Delaney nodded, completely serious. "I want that, and I think you do too." Lila didn't answer right away, but then she nodded, once slowly, like it scared her to want it, but she wanted it anyway. That night, after Delaney fell asleep, Lila walked quietly into Simon's office, her bare feet making almost no sound. He looked up from his desk. "Yes?" She stood in the doorway, her voice small but steady. "If you still want me here, I'd like to stay." Simon rose from his chair, crossed the room, and crouched to her level. "You don't have to earn your place, Lila. You already have it." Then he hugged her, carefully like something precious, and Lila let herself believe, maybe for the first time in her life, that home wasn't just a place. It was a choice, and someone had finally chosen her. Spring came early that year. The trees outside the Ridge estate were already speckled with soft pink blossoms, and the hedges lining the drive had been trimmed into neat waves. The scent of new growth lingered in the air, carried on warm breezes that drifted through the open windows. But inside, something even more extraordinary had bloomed. The house was no longer a fortress of silence and wealth. It breathed differently now. It laughed. It played music. It whispered stories under blankets. It carried the gentle chaos of something that had once been missing. A soul. Lila Grace had been living with the Ridges for nearly 3 months. In that time, she had transformed, but not in the way some people expected. She hadn't lost her sharpness or her humility. She still asked for second-hand books and wrote on the backs of napkins when she ran out of journals. She still ate slowly, carefully, like someone who had known real hunger, but something in her posture had changed. She stood taller now. The look in her eyes, once watchful and guarded, now held light. Delaney called her "my sister" in front of everyone, at school, at dinner, to their neighbors. And no one corrected her anymore, especially not Simon. The process of adoption had begun. The paperwork was long, complicated by Lila's lack of records. But Simon had hired a team of lawyers who specialized in child advocacy. He made it clear he would wait as long as it took. But the real moment, the moment none of them would ever forget, came on a Saturday afternoon in late March. It began with an idea. Delaney had begged her father to let her school host a Words Matter event, something inspired by Lila's sign, her voice, and all she had taught. Simon, of course, agreed. He paid for the venue, helped organize the speakers, and made sure every child in the school, whether wealthy or on scholarship, could attend. But Delaney had one condition. "Lila has to read first," she said. "It started with her. It should start with her." Lila protested at first, terrified by the thought of standing on stage before hundreds of people. "What if I mess up?" she said the night before, clutching the folded pages of her speech like a shield. Simon knelt beside her and said something she would carry forever. "Lila, your words saved my daughter's heart. They brought you into this family. There's no messing up when what you speak is true." So, the next day, under warm lights and in front of a crowd of curious children, skeptical parents, and a panel of invited guests, Lila stepped onto the stage. She wore a navy blue dress Rosa had altered for her and the same red ribbon in her hair, from the day Simon first saw her on the sidewalk. She took a shaky breath, and then she began. When I was younger, she said, her voice quiet but clear, I thought being invisible was safer. I thought if no one saw me, no one could throw me away. Silence fell over the auditorium. But then someone did see me, a girl with kindness in her eyes and poems in her pocket. She sat with me on a sidewalk when no one else would. She didn't care that my clothes didn't match or that my life didn't fit into neat little boxes. She just listened, and she reminded me that words matter, not because they're fancy, but because they let us reach each other. She paused, unfolding the next page. I used to think stories were for people who already had everything, but now I know they're for people who have nothing. They're the only thing that kept me going when the world turned its back. And today I stand here not because I was rescued, but because someone believed I had something to give. A long hush followed her final sentence, then a slow rising applause, then cheers. Delaney was the first to run up to her, arms wide and eyes shining. The two girls hugged tightly, and the crowd rose to their feet. Parents wiped their eyes. Teachers exchanged stunned looks, and Simon stood at the back of the auditorium, unable to move, because his heart felt too full to let his body follow. Later that evening, after the event, they sat in the garden, Lila, Delaney, and Simon, watching the last light of the day bleed into the sky. You did something big today, Simon said, his voice soft with awe. Lila shook her head gently. I just told the truth. No, he said. You lit a fire in people's hearts. And I hope you know, you'll never be invisible again. Lila smiled then, a real whole smile. The kind of smile that belongs to someone who knows they're finally home. And somewhere deep inside her, the girl who once sat alone beneath a tree with a cardboard sign knew she'd never need to ask to be seen again. Because now, she wasn't just seen, she was loved, she was chosen, and she would never be forgotten. In my view, the ending of this story is not just heartwarming, it's transformative. What makes this finale so powerful is that it doesn't rely on grand gestures or fantasy resolutions. Instead, it centers on something deeply human, the quiet miracle of being seen, truly seen, for who you are. Lila's journey isn't about being saved by money. It's about being recognized for the brilliance she already carried within her. Simon's arc shows us that redemption doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes when a powerful man finally listens to a small voice. Delaney, though just a child, becomes the moral compass. A reminder that empathy isn't taught, it's lived. And the fact that Lila doesn't end up in the background as a grateful figure, but instead rises as a voice for others, gives the story the kind of strength that lingers. She begins as invisible and ends as irreplaceable, not because of charity, but because of choice and courage. This isn't just a story about one girl finding a home. It's about what happens when the walls we build around status, fear, and judgment are torn down, brick by a child with a book and a sign that said, even if you're richer than me. To me, that's not just a happy ending. That's a better beginning for all of us